A mysterious and truly detective story unfolded on May 23, 1981. On that day, the Soviet nuclear missile submarine K-211 of the Kalmar project, not to be confused with K-219, which is sometimes mistakenly mentioned in publications, was on combat duty in the cold waters of the Barents Sea. At 1952 ship time, the crew felt three powerful blows, as if the hull of the boat had hit something massive and hidden in the depths. Immediately after that, a loud metallic screech ran through the hull, causing many to experience temporary hearing loss. The commander ordered an immediate ascent. K-211 surfaced and, despite serious damage, made it back to base under its own power. When specialists began to examine the boat, they discovered damage in the area of the main ballast tanks. And the most mysterious thing was that bolts with hidden heads were stuck inside, as well as fragments of a tube that clearly belonged to another submarine. The Soviet Commission carefully studied these findings and concluded that the collision had occurred with a foreign submarine. This version was later indirectly confirmed by intelligence reports. Moscow received information that a Los Angeles-class nuclear submarine with a severely damaged conning tower had arrived at the American naval base in Holy Bay. The nature of the damage, according to descriptions, matched that sustained by K-211. For a long time, this version, a collision with the Americans, was considered the only correct one in Soviet military circles. However, 10 years later, in 1991, former British officer David Floor, according to other sources, unexpectedly admitted in an interview with British television that on that day, the Soviet submarine had collided not with the Americans, but with the British nuclear submarine HMS Scepter. According to him, the impact was so strong that the British submarine barely escaped destruction and was later secretly repaired. This admission overturned previous perceptions of the incident. The American side never commented on the matter, either then, in the early 1980s, or later, when the information resurfaced in the press. The official silence gave rise to even more rumors and speculation. Some believed that the U.S. deliberately concealed the incident so as not to compromise its NATO allies. Others claimed that it was the American boat that was involved in the collision, and that the British officer's admission was merely an attempt to deflect blame from the Allies. Thus, even decades later, there are still many unanswered questions surrounding this event. Soviet documents and British confessions give different versions, while American sources remain silent. Therefore, when discussing this incident, we have to rely solely on the testimony of Soviet sailors and British officers. After the Caribbean crisis, the world seemed to take a breath. The so-called détente began, a unique period in the history of the Cold War when the nuclear confrontation between the two superpowers, the USSR and the US, temporarily gave way to diplomacy and dialogue. In the late 1960s, a fragile but fundamentally important nuclear parity was achieved, based on the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD. This concept meant that any attack by one side would inevitably lead to a retaliatory strike that would destroy both the attacker and the defender. Thus, nuclear weapons became less a means of attack and more a factor of deterrence. In the 1970s, Soviet leader Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev actively built personal contacts with the leaders of the world's leading powers. He met with U.S. President Richard Nixon and established trusting relationships with West German Chancellor Willy Brandt and French President Georges Pompidou. This laid the foundation for the signing of important treaties on the limitation of strategic arms, SALT I, as well as the 1975 Helsinki Accords, which enshrined the principles of security and cooperation in Europe. For the first time in a long time, there was a sense of cautious rapprochement between the two systems, capitalist and socialist, which was perceived by the people as a thaw. However, this relative calm did not last long. By the end of 1979, after the Soviet troops entered Afghanistan, the world was once again plunged into a phase of acute confrontation. The U.S. sharply condemned the Kremlin's actions, stating that Moscow had violated the geopolitical balance and moved to a policy of open expansion. In response, Washington increased military pressure. The production of the latest weapons, including neutron bombs, was accelerated. These bombs were not intended to destroy infrastructure, but to destroy enemy manpower with minimal material losses. These weapons were seen as a means of deterring a possible offensive by Warsaw Pact troops in Europe. The Soviet leadership, in turn, responded harshly. The special services and the general staff began to develop plans for retaliatory measures in the event of a sudden nuclear strike. Already in the summer of 1982, the USSR, together with the Warsaw Pact countries, conducted the largest-scale exercises, Shield 82. A record number of missile systems, strategic aircraft, and anti-missile defense systems were involved. These maneuvers were intended to demonstrate to the West that the Soviet Union was ready to launch an instant nuclear retaliatory strike in the event of aggression. The escalation also affected the world's oceans. American nuclear submarines increasingly approached the coast of the Soviet Union, simulating a surprise nuclear strike on industrial and military centers. After the end of the period of détente and the beginning of a new wave of the Cold War, the oceans became an arena of covert confrontation. The US and the USSR launched large-scale naval programs, in which submarine warfare played a key role. American submarines hunting for Soviet nuclear missile carriers with ballistic missiles acted boldly and professionally. They waited for Soviet Navy boats in so-called waiting areas, in the Barents Sea, near the Kola Bay, and also near Avachinskaya Bay in the Far East. As soon as a Soviet missile submarine left its base on combat duty, an enemy submarine would discreetly follow it, trying to get into a good spot for tracking and, if needed, a quick attack. The Soviet leadership understood perfectly well that such an enemy strategy posed a direct threat to strategic parity. Therefore, special security measures were taken even at the stage of leaving the base. Each missile carrier was followed by small anti-submarine ships, base minesweepers, and anti-submarine aircraft, which were tasked with combing the water area, dropping hydroacoustic buoys, checking for tracking boats, and guiding the Soviet submarine out to the open sea without a tail. This work was extremely difficult, requiring the coordination of dozens of crews and strict observance of radio silence. When the boat left the coastal zone and headed for combat patrol areas, its crew was instructed to independently verify that it was not being followed. To do this, various tactical evasive maneuvers were used: sharp changes in course and depth, stopping the boat and then listening to the sea, and launching hydroacoustic decoys. The submariners deliberately went to areas with complex seabed relief, where noise distorted sonar signals, or tried to get lost among civilian ships to make tracking difficult. Nevertheless, the American hunters were persistent. Their goal was not only to escort Soviet missile carriers, but also to gather intelligence, recording noise profiles of submarines, tracking their routes, time of departure, and even possible combat scenarios. In response, Soviet sailors often resorted to pseudo-camouflage. Several boats went on duty at once, creating the illusion that the enemy had lost contact, or they simulated damage to mislead the hunters. The rotating propeller of any submarine created strong acoustic noise and so-called hydrodynamic distortions that interfered with the operation of onboard sonars. This is why a dead zone formed behind the submarine's stern, a sector where the pulses of hydroacoustic stations could not reach. For the enemy, this zone became an ideal hiding place. It was enough to take the right position relative to the propellers, and it was almost impossible to detect the boat. American and British hunters very often took advantage of this vulnerability, literally tailing Soviet missile carriers. The crews of Soviet submarines were well aware of this problem, so in combat practice there was a special tactical maneuver, a sharp change of course, up to a complete turn, in order to light up the dead zone and make sure that there was no surveillance. The maneuver was considered risky because it was performed suddenly and could lead to an accident or collision with the enemy if they were indeed in close proximity. It was precisely because of the danger and unpredictability that American sailors nicknamed this technique Crazy Ivan. On May 23, 1981, one of the most famous incidents of this kind occurred. According to Soviet and British sources, on that day, the Soviet nuclear missile submarine K-219, Project Kalmar, was in the Barents Sea. It was on combat duty, conducting covert patrols and awaiting a possible signal to start a nuclear war. According to the regulations, upon receiving such a signal, the crew was to launch a massive nuclear missile strike on enemy military bases and strategic targets. On the same day, not far from the Soviet naval bases on the Kola Peninsula, the British nuclear submarine Scepter, belonging to the Swiftsea class, was operating. It detected the departure of the Soviet missile carrier and began covert surveillance, taking up a position in the dead zone, some distance to the right of the line of movement, slightly lower in depth, where the noise of the propellers completely masked its own signals. After a while, the commander of K-219 decided not to rely solely on his intuition and gave the order to check the dead zone using the onboard MGK-400 Rubicon hydroacoustic complex. This device was considered one of the best in the Soviet fleet, but even it had limited capabilities when operating in conditions of strong propeller noise. To eliminate the slightest risk of surveillance, the commander ordered a sharp turn of about 80 degrees, which allowed the space behind the stern to be illuminated and a possible enemy to be identified. At that moment, the British submarine Scepter, which had been sailing in the dead zone of the Soviet missile cruiser, suddenly lost sight of it on its hydroacoustic post. The commander of the Scepter instantly realized that the Soviet crew had begun the Crazy Ivan maneuver. This was extremely dangerous for the British. Any delay threatened a direct collision. Therefore, the order was given to immediately stop the engines and enter complete silence mode. All mechanisms in the compartments were shut down, and any noise had to be minimized so as not to reveal their position. However, physics prevailed. Despite the order, the inertia of the heavy nuclear-powered vessel prevented it from stopping instantly. The submarine continued to move forward, and after a few seconds, loud bangs were heard along the hull of the Scepter. At the same time, the crew of the Soviet boat felt 3 powerful jolts from below, as if someone had driven a metal ram across the bottom. Hydroacoustics recorded the noise of the propellers of an unknown submarine, but contact was lost almost immediately. The vessels drifted apart, avoiding more serious damage. The Soviet K-219 surfaced and headed for base under its own power. During a subsequent inspection of the hull, engineers discovered damage to the vertical rudder and traces of impact in the propeller area, and fragments of another submarine's hull were stuck in the propeller. This evidence became the main proof that the collision had indeed occurred not with an iceberg or a rocky ridge, but with an enemy submarine. The British Scepter found itself in a much more difficult situation. At the moment of impact, its most important components were damaged: pipelines and part of the structure near the reactor compartment. According to the instructions, in such a situation, the automatic emergency shutdown of the reactor should have been activated to prevent a possible nuclear accident. But the commander of the Scepter, fearing exposure, gave the order to manually disable the protection, maintaining speed, and led the boat away from the scene. The submarine headed for its base in the UK at maximum speed. Later, in official reports and to the press, the British claimed that their nuclear submarine Scepter had allegedly collided with an iceberg during exercises in the Barents Sea. This version seemed convincing to the public, but the sailors knew perfectly well that icebergs are extremely rare in that area and that the nature of the damage to the hull did not match that of an impact with ice. After the collision, Soviet specialists discovered some very unusual traces in the damaged ballast tanks of K-219, often mistakenly referred to as K-21, although it was actually a Kalmar-class missile submarine. Inside were bolts with countersunk heads, characteristic of fasteners that were not used on Soviet boats. In addition, fragments of twisted pipes and hull parts, clearly belonging to another submarine, were stuck in the metal plating. The USSR Navy Commission carefully studied these findings and came to an official conclusion. The collision occurred with an American Sturgeon-class nuclear submarine, STN. This conclusion seemed the most logical, since in those years it was submarines of this type that were actively on duty in the Barents Sea, tracking the routes of Soviet missile carriers. The experts' version was confirmed by intelligence. It soon became known that a Sturgeon-class submarine with a damaged conning tower had indeed arrived at the American base at Holy Loch, Great Britain, and the nature of the damage coincided with the accident scenario described by the Soviet side. For a long time, this version was considered official and fundamental in closed military circles. However, in 1991, there was a real breakthrough in understanding the events. Former British officer David Four, who served on the nuclear submarine Scepter, gave a sensational interview. He stated outright that on May 23, 1981, in the Barents Sea, the Soviet submarine collided not with the Americans, but with the British Scepter. His statements were later indirectly confirmed by a number of British open sources. Thus, it became clear that the Soviet Commission could have been mistaken in interpreting the fragments and details. The confusion may have been caused by external similarities. The American Sturgeon submarines did resemble the British Scepter in their overall architecture, but their conning towers had a number of design differences. In particular, the British submarine had a more streamlined shape of the retractable device enclosure, which explained the nature of the damage. The main clue remained the bolts with hidden heads that were stuck in the hull of the Soviet submarine. After discovering the bolts and fragments of the hull, Soviet Navy experts concluded that analysis of such details could provide enough information to determine the type of submarine they belonged to. It was precisely such silent evidence that often became key in investigations of maritime incidents, as the official parties preferred to remain silent. One could even put forward a fantastical hypothesis that on that day, the Soviet missile carrier was indeed being tracked by two hunters at once, British and American submarines, and that the collision occurred with both. However, this version falls apart on one major contradiction. Why then has the American side remained silent until now? Usually, years later, the Pentagon or the U.S. Navy declassifies data on such incidents, confirming or refuting the facts of collisions with Soviet submarines. If we take the Soviet version of the collision with a Sturgeon-class (STN) submarine as a basis, then everything should be transparent. The history of each such nuclear-powered vessel is documented, and accidents are described in detail in open American sources. Thus, it is known that on August 30, 1968, the nuclear submarine USS Tautog, Sturgeon class, collided with the Soviet submarine K-10 in the northern Pacific Ocean. This incident is officially recognized. On March 20, 1993, in the Barents Sea, the American submarine USS Grayling of the same class did indeed collide with the Soviet missile submarine K-407 Novomoskovsk. And these are only some of the recorded incidents. A complete list of all accidents and collisions involving Soviet and American submarines can be found in the open archives of the United States and in independent studies. But there is not a single mention of the incident on May 23, 1981. Thus, a paradox arises. On the one hand, Soviet experts and intelligence pointed to the Americans' trail. On the other hand, the American side, which usually acknowledges such facts years later, remains completely silent in this case. This does not seem like a coincidence, but rather resembles a deliberate concealment of information. That is why the 1981 incident remains one of the most mysterious stories of the Cold War at sea. Some believe that the collision was with the British scepter, others that it was with the Americans, but that the fact was concealed for political reasons. Still others believe that the matter was much more complicated. The presence of several hunters in the area at once, unauthorized maneuvers, and a chain of errors that neither side wanted to publicize. This mystery still fuels rumors and theories, turning what happened into a real detective story in the depths of the world's oceans.